Welcome to the Thresholds of Reality, the podcast where we explore unexplained and mysterious events, phenomena, and legends. Today we are talking with producer of Netflix's Haunted, Trace Slobotkin, and we'll look forward to hearing all the mysterious tales that he gathered to produce the show. So strap in as we examine the edges of the unknown. Trace, thank you so much for joining us on the show. As you're probably aware, we are a supernatural paranormal podcast. We talk to a lot of people. We don't just do paranormal stuff, though. Sometimes we talk about unsolved mysteries. Our first episode is actually about hometown homicides. People that we actually knew. Like I knew a gal who went out in the desert and never came home. And wow. Those kinds of personal experiences really inspired us to do the show. And I guess my question for you is, what inspired you to produce the show on Netflix?
Well, I actually the show was actually already starting when I got called to come in and be involved with it. The producers had already sold it and actually brought in somebody else who got fired. I don't know why, but it was my good fortune that they got fired. And David Price, who was the co-EP, he and I had worked together before, and he knew that I was a huge horror movie fan. But generally, I had only done writing, and they needed a producer, someone that could do interviews and take it from start to finish. But it did have a really strong writing element to it as well. And he was actually calling to see if I knew anybody else, because he's like, I know you're more of a writer and not really a producer. And when I heard the concept of the show, I wanted to be involved. So I was like, no, I can produce also. And I'd done a lot of work in reality TV. So I knew how to do interviews and all that stuff. I had never really done it. I told him I did, but I had never
you always got a budget.
Right. Yeah. It was, a fake it till you make it kind of thing. But it really wasn't. I mean, it was really all in my wheelhouse anyway. So I really took to it pretty quickly. So when they brought me in, they had already had most of the stories ready for the season. And they kind of threw me on to the ones that were already in progress. So,
yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the format of the show. So you have folks come in and they're give recorded interviews, and then you guys then take the stories that they tell and produce them into dramatized, basically horror vignettes,
right?
That make up the episodes, right?
Yeah. So the way it was always sort of crafted and pitched was that the difference, the thing that they wanted Haunted to be different from sort of other shows was that they wanted these recreations to be really cool, stand on their own, a short horror movie, basically a short horror film. So from the start, we told the participants, we're going to tell your story, but there might be some leeway taken here or there because we ultimately want to craft a really scary, horror short. So that was sort of from the start how it was crafted, that it wasn't going to be like some of the other shows where they'll do a recreation and they have sometimes actors that are not the best and they're kind of cheesy recreations. We were always keeping the dialogue to a minimum and trying to make it as scary and as cinematic as possible. And so the process was the casting people would go out and they would go on different supernatural blogs or sites, and they put out casting notices. They would to try and find people, and then they would sort of parse through that, pitch those to the executive producers, who would then sort of decide with the network which stories they liked. And then we as producers would then take the top picks. Maybe we did 6 a season, so maybe we had 10 to 15 top picks, and then we would call those people and do an interview with them and sort of get more of their story, and then sort of write up that story to help pitch it and narrow it down to the 6 we did each season. So I would have a call if I got a story. I would then call up at least the primary person involved, and then sometimes their friends and family or whoever we thought might be involved in their circle, and do an interview with them and write up the story. And then that was a whole process. And then, yes, for the production, we would bring them out. They would tell their story in their circle. We'd get all their information. And then that was pretty much when we were done as the story producers. We wrote up a script. We interviewed the cast, and then the producers went off to was it Czechoslovakia? It was another country is where they shot the I think it was like Romania or somewhere like that, where they would shoot the recreations.
Oh, wow.
They had a foreign crew. It was a typical sort of reality TV. It was cheaper to do it that way.
Oh, I see. Okay.
If you go back and watch the episodes, sometimes you'll see with that in mind. Sometimes you can hear like accents a little. They'll come through a little bit in some of the actors. But yeah, so they went off and filmed it. So I didn't really even see. Sometimes I would get to see a cut if I would stop by the office and stuff. But a lot of times we didn't even see it until it aired on Netflix, the final product.
So that's very interesting. Now, the gathering of the stories, you had other people do that. Did you have any supervision in that? Kind of getting the people whose stories you adapted?
It was, it was hard. It was definitely hard finding people for the show, because it's the kind of show where somebody needs to have been haunted for a prolonged period of time, because, right, we're telling a story. So we needed a good story. It couldn't just be, I came home one night and crazy stuff happened at my house. I saw a ghost, or I went to a hotel and I saw a ghost and had this crazy one night. Like, it needed to be people that had like a prolonged thing happen to them. So we had a story to tell. So it was really hard to find people. But the casting people, they reached out and found some good people. And then, it was always an interesting thing of picking which stories. A lot of times it was, this one's a ghost story and this seems like a possession story, and or we had 2 ghost stories, so we were like, well, this one's better than this one, so we'll go with that one this season over that. And the so it was all a matter of which was the most interesting story, which people seemed like the best characters to tell their stories, and then the other element too, another behind the scenes sort of thing, is that the people had to pass background checks, and they would have to do like psych evaluations and stuff, and have like legal background, if they had any sort of legal problems in the past, sometimes that was flagged. We had a couple, not many, but there was a couple people that didn't pass the background checks, and we unfortunately couldn't use their stories.
Okay, so what disqualified them? Was it the psych eval or the criminal eval?
They never told us. It's one of those things where they try to keep the person's privacy limited. So when they're doing those background checks, it's like limited to like maybe one network executive and one executive on the show to preserve those people's privacy. So I actually never learned the exact thing. There was the one that I'm mainly thinking of. There was a really great story that we tried to do. I think we tried to do it second season, and then I forget what happened, why it didn't work second season or first season. Then we tried it the next season, and it went pretty far, and then the main person didn't pass. He had some sort of criminal past, I believe. There was some, but his story was really really creepy about. There was a he thought he was cursed basically by a bruja, which is like a
Witch.
witch, and he when he was a teenager he got someone pregnant, and being a kind of careless teenager denied that the kid was his, and he, according to him, this girl who he got pregnant, her mom was a bruja and cursed him, and he started having all these intense things happen to him, and he would even he would disappear on me, and he wouldn't return my calls or my emails or anything, and then I would finally get a hold of him, and he sounded really distressed, and would tell me that every time he spoke to us about being on the show, that the things that were happening to him got more intense. He would wake up in the middle of the night. He would have these episodes where he basically felt like he was blacking out, and would come to again, and had felt like he had been violent and stuff like that. The main, every story that I did always had one thing that was just oh, this is cool. We got to, do this one because this scene would be really cool. And I remember his was that he went into his kitchen at one point, and I think it was his stepfather, turned his head to him and said something like we're going to get you or something, and then bent backwards. He said that he bent over and his body folded in half and bent over backwards, and was talking to him in some sort of demonic voice. And it was just that was very creepy. We get this one on camera, but unfortunately he didn't pass the background. And like I said, he was very unreliable. He kept, coming in and out, and then he would disappear. And so that one did make it. And then we had somebody else that had some sort of that was not a main person, but they were going to be in the circle of people, and they had some sort of misdemeanor. They were on a red flag list, or sexual predators, or something like that, where the network was you just can't have those kind of liabilities.
They just can't eliminate that person from the circle, or since they're part of the story, they have to.
Yeah, no, a lot of times we would, but sometimes, in that case, the problem with that story was it was a UFO case, and that guy was he was the only other witness we had that had apparently been there when this person had seen something. So it really, that was part of the other part that made the show difficult to produce, was that it's not just the main person that's going to tell their story. Part of what made Haunted feel so real and more, believable, I guess, in a sense, than some of the other shows, is that this is a whole group of people that, sometimes and hopefully there was other people that were witnesses to the things they had seen and were there. Right. And then sometimes we had other people that they were telling them. It was almost like a coming out, hey, I've had a supernatural experience with their family members. But we always tried to have somebody else who could back up their story to sort of give it that realism. And when we lost that person, a lot of times it would hurt the story, and we would maybe look to another story.
So what was the creepiest story that just that gave you chills to read or to hear?
There were so many of them. That one that I just told you about was a really creepy one, just because that guy, he just, whenever I called him, you could hear it in his voice, and he would even say to me, he'd be like, Trace, man, it's really just you could tell this was someone really going through some psychological torture from this thing, and I really felt bad for the guy. And one thing that I had actually said to him that we found with the show was that it became this sort of weird supernatural therapy for everybody that was involved. It was a very much when they would come and they would do this process, they would feel a weight off their shoulders. It was, they got to tell this story that in an environment where people made them feel, believed and not,
Like
they
a crazy
normally,
person.
yeah, and they a lot of them never told their stories and never really got to speak to anybody about it because they were worried that people would think they were crazy. So even when there was another one that kind of gave me chills that we were going to do in the third season and it never came about. Um, that was a family. They were women who had, like, all the men in their lives became violent, and they felt that there was a curse on their family. I forget what the specifics were, but the main woman's father had, when she was a little girl, she was sitting in the living room with her mom, and her father just came in and seemed like a completely different person and shot her mother in front of her, and then killed himself. Or he shot himself. He didn't die right away, but and then, like, so she was orphaned, her, and I think she had a sister, um, as a kid, and then was haunted for the rest of her life from all this. And it was like, just talking to them, that whole story was really, just because there was not just a supernatural element to it, there was this really heartbreaking sort of
Yeah,
core to
tragic
the story. Yeah, and I remember just talking to them. Like, I think I had a 3-hour interview with her because it was, I could tell that for her it was really emotional. Like, she thanked me at the end, like it was like a therapy session for her, and she was so thankful that we got to do this because it was really helpful. That one was just because of the deep circumstances. The one the first one that I did was pretty was pretty intense, which was The Woman in White, it was the first episode, I think, in the first season. um, that The story was that he kept seeing this, that he moved into this place as a kid, and he started seeing this woman in white coming out of his closet, and finally found out when his parents went to move, and his parents made him feel like he was crazy. And when he went to move, he overheard people saying that they were surprised that the family lived in this place for so long because someone had killed themselves and I think their kids in this place, in his apartment. So he was seeing, that's what he felt like he was seeing. And then even after they moved, he felt as though this woman was following him along. And when the story first came to me, it was that he finally met somebody. He had had a near death experience where he was sick. I think he had the flu, and he still went to work, and it was like too much for him, and he almost died. He, like, overheated. He almost died, or came close to death. And then they took him to the hospital. He was better, and initially the story was that he never saw the woman in white again, and he was fine. And then when I did my interview with him, I was really prying him for story details and getting more detail. And he finally broke down at one point and said, I have to be honest, I've been seeing her again. And he was really, like, emotionally, like it gives me chills now just talking about it, because I'm somebody who came into this completely skeptical. I love horror movies. I love watching shows about ghosts and supernatural things, but I've always been a skeptic for the most part. And I sort of came into the show in that way. I'm very skeptical. I want to see the proof. And working on this show completely changed my point of view now I either don't, I'm not sure, or I believe. There was so many things that, because when you talked, it's not like, and it was the case with this guy, was that there was not, he didn't seem weird to me. He didn't seem like a kook. He was a normal guy. We had a lot of conversations, and he was a very normal guy. And he would, when almost everybody that I talked to, when they would talk about their experiences, they would tell you this story the same way someone would tell you a story about how their family went on a vacation or whatever. It was very factual. And these people, especially the ones that got past the point to where, where they were almost going to be on the show, these people were generally believable. And so it made you kind of really, when you would hear these stories and when they would get emotional about things, it would give you chills, because you would definitely feel like, wow, how do I explain this? How is this possible that he's seeing these things? And so there was, that was one when he broke down. That was when I remember just sort of giving me chills and being like, wow, this is really creepy.
So as you're taking in these stories, you're obviously imagining what the process of putting it together is going to be like. There's some amount of creature design that goes into it, right?
Yeah.
Did you get any sign off from the folks whose stories you were recreating, or did you just take full control, full imaginative, full creative control, and create the scariest things you could think of?
Well, it's a good question, because when I'm, as somebody who was skeptical and hearing these stories and making me believe, I wanted to keep it as real as possible. So I really tried to, when I was writing up the stories, if I was doing anything, that was a bit of taking dramatic license, I tried to just maybe exaggerate something here or there, or do it somewhere in the gray area. So, but when I would interview these people, my mind was always thinking, and because I'm a screenwriter first and foremost, I was always thinking of what's the movie here, and what's the, so I was when they were telling me their stories, I was always looking for moments that would be cool, scary moments, and would press them for those kind of details. What did you like? The specific details were always what really made it creepy. So I would always try and find details or unique things that were for their stories, or things that I had never seen in a horror movie, or that were cool. Those were the moment I was really trying to find real ones. For example, there's a UFO one that we did the first season. I think it's the second to last episode, with someone with a great person, Lindsay Higgins, who was a great person on the show. And she had one detail in her story that creeped me out so much. I was like, we have to do this. And her story was that she had been abducted by aliens. And the visual that I love the most is that she was sleeping in a house on the second level, woke up in the middle of the night. The wall seemed to like dissipate. She was able to see through the wall and could sort of see this craft behind the wall. And she started to get sucked out of her bed. And she was trying to sort of hold on to anything she could to keep herself from getting sucked out. And finally, the force was too strong. It starts pulling her out, and she grabs onto the ceiling fan and is holding on to the ceiling fan. And then finally can't hold it, lets go. She gets sucked out. The next thing she knows, she wakes up, she's in her bed in the morning. And so, is it real? It could have all just been a dream. It could have been sleep paralysis, whatever. But according to Lindsay, she wakes up the next morning, gets a ladder, walks up and looks at the top of the ceiling fan, and there's fingerprints in the dust on top of the ceiling fan. Right? So when I heard that, I was like, we got to do, like, that's the moment. That's super cool, because that's a specific detail that somebody, again, I don't know if I really believe that aliens sucked her out of the wall. Like, I don't know, but I do know that someone who's making up a story, that's a really specific detail. We've all seen dust on the top of, we know what that is. And to come up with that detail, it seems way too specific to be something that someone would make up. And it's such a cool one. It's such a creepy, cool detail. So that was something that I was like, we have to put in. So as far as the creatures and stuff, a lot of times people would give us a description, and we would, try and make it like that. But Haunted was a little bit like a game of telephone, in that as the producers, we would write up the script, and I would maybe describe the creature the way the person described it to me as best as they could. Sometimes they wouldn't have all the details, but I would put in whatever they put. But what I mean by a game of telephone is that then, once we were done, it went off to the director who was directing all these things and the special effects team, and it was out of our hands. So they were now taking it from a movie making perspective, and they would look at what we had, but then they would sort of go off on their own and do it. One of the other things too, especially in the first season, it was supposed to be an hour-long show. So our stories were pretty long. And for whatever reason, when they got into editing, they found that the show worked better shorter. So a lot of the stuff kind of got cut down and the stories got truncated so that, the things went quicker. It didn't, sometimes they fudge details or put details together in order to fit into the time slot that didn't really play out exactly the way they did, just to make it sort of fit the story structure. So it was like, it was kind of thing where it would go to the director and then go to the special effects people, and then it was going off to Romania, wherever they shot it. And so, the stories got changed a little bit as it got down. So that was sort of, they were designing the creatures and they would take some license with that.
Yeah. So as the show has progressed over time, are there things that now you hear them and you're like, that's old hat for me now. I'm so used to this process. You can't really faze me with the story anymore. Or do you still get surprised? Is season 3 still as surprising to you as season 1?
Yeah. I mean, it's been a few years now. Season 3 was right on the cusp of the COVID lockdown. And which was, every season had gotten progressively more difficult to find people, to find, stories, but we still got some really cool, creepy stories. We were still finding good stuff, but with season 3, I literally think they shot it like a week before like the lockdown happened. And we were starting to hit all these problems with getting people to travel, because that's when everyone was starting to worry about traveling and all that stuff. So it was really difficult to produce, and we lost a bunch of stories because of that. But yeah, the stories were they were still pretty surprising. There were still some cool things we were hearing and scary things that we were hearing. There was a guy that didn't make it on in Canada who had like a Wendigo story, which was a unique, interesting one. And I also mentioned the one with the woman whose father had killed himself and her mother. That one was, so there were different things, and yeah, it still creeped me out. I distinctly remember, because I was living in New Jersey at the time. I had moved back to New Jersey for a couple of years, so I was working remotely before we were all working remotely on season 3, and I remember just sitting in my place and interviewing people for season 3, and yeah, still creepy stories. There was another one that was a potential for season 3 that didn't happen. That there was a kid. He was a young guy, and he had people die in his life on the same exact day every year. And it was a really, because it was something I think there was 3 people in his life that had died on the same day. And so that one was, surprising and shocking, because we could show, okay, he's this friend and that friend and his dad had all died on this day, the same date in different years. You can prove that, and that's such a weird, if it's a coincidence, how is that it's such, what are the odds of that?
Billions to 1.
Right, exactly. Wow. So there was always stuff that was surprising and interesting.
Are there any stories that you found out that they were just for attention, or they just were 100% made up, and you couldn't like, you were just like,
And you're like, yeah, that still would be a good story.
Yeah. There was a few, but most of the ones that felt that way usually would never make that. They would feel that out in casting. There was, the casting department would start to feel like,
Sorry about that.
all right, I think, that this one seems like they're maybe making something up. So it wouldn't usually get that far to us. Like I said, I was working remotely on season 3, and I know there was a few of those that they kind of felt that way. But we were at that point by season 3, we were splitting up stories. There was a few producers, so I only had like 2 or 3 of them. The other producers had 2 or 3 of their own, and none of mine felt, at least if they were doing it to get attention, I never suspected it. They all seemed pretty legit, because most of the people, even the people that responded to be on the show, still needed some convincing. There was a lot of these people weren't really gung-ho about doing the show. A lot of times I had to convince them. They were sort of like, yeah, I don't know if I want to go through this process.
I mean, it's a hard thing you experience this stuff, and it's a hard thing to bring yourself to put it out for the world. Because you do, when you're done telling a story like that, you're going to be like, these people just think I'm just crazy. And there's no way I'd want these people to think that I'm crazy, because it's a hard thing to have to put yourself out there like that.
Yeah, 100%. In fact, the story I told you, the UFO one with Lindsay, one of the people that she brought for her circle was her cousin, who she's very close with, who didn't know any of this stuff. And so part of her thing was that she was going to reveal this to some of her family members, her cousin being one. And I remember after we shot, her cousin was very sweet. And she came up to me, because this was the first she was hearing, and she was concerned, or she called me afterwards, and she was concerned that we were going to make Lindsay look crazy. And, and she was concerned. And I told her, I said, look, this is not that show. We're not here trying to debunk anybody or make anybody look crazy. We're trying to tell a good story. And so we're not going to make this seem like, oh, she's full of it. We're going to tell her story. And if anything, it's going to feel more real by the end of it. But yeah, people were definitely, especially the ones that were bringing people that they were going to reveal this story to, were a lot of times concerned that they would come off as crazy, or, were hesitant to do it. But once we had done that first season, I was able to confidently tell people that everybody who's done it has thanked me afterwards, and that has felt a relief and was so happy that they did this process. Some of the people, their family members, they had been distanced from each other because of these experiences, and it brought them back together. And everybody really felt like, some of the people they brought their kids who were now grown, and they felt like a stronger bond with their kids because of this. So everybody had a good experience, and I was able to confidently tell people that, that if you come do this, you're gonna be happy that you did it. It's like a therapy session.
Nice.
That's so cool. One of the things that I was on a show called American Ninja Warrior a couple times, and one of the things that really surprised me about that show was the production side of things, the behind the camera stuff. You're watching an hour program that it takes all day to film, and then it takes weeks to produce. What can you tell us about some of the behind the scenes stuff that goes into the process of making this show that we'd be surprised to learn?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, I sort of already explained, the whole process of, we would find, there was a casting department that would find people, and which a lot of times they would sort of run. When we got to the second season, there was a few stories that I was really I wanted us to do. I wanted to do an exorcism one. That was like a big thing. I was like, we got to do something with possession and exorcism. So I kept going down like, do we have any stories? Have you guys found anything yet? And so, it all goes through the casting department and then goes down to us. We interview the people. I don't know that there's, like I said, but they came and we would shoot their story and them telling their story. And then, I guess the most surprising thing is what I said, that they would then go off to Romania and recreate these things. And that team, like I said, was totally separate from us. We weren't even sort of, the executive producer was, I think in the second and third season, the executive producer, the one producer, was the one who would go over and supervise those things. So it was almost a whole different crew they were making their own show. They were doing the recreations and these, sort of horror versions. So if anything, it was probably that aspect of it. And then like any show, after they go and shoot their stuff, it all goes through editing. And when the editors are doing it, they're just trying to tell a good story. So, sometimes the stories would get watered down or changed a little bit as they're telling their story. And that's what then the final product becomes what it is.
So we have an overnight ghost hunt coming up later this month.
Cool.
And if you were there to kind of set up the shots, what would you do to set up like a ghost hunt?
Well, that's a good story, and I'll bring it back to one of my favorite haunted stories, because like I said, there was always some element in every story I did. There was one thing that I was like, I can't explain that. That's super cool. And so one of the ones from season 1, I think it was the last episode, was a couple that was in the military I think it was in the barracks that they lived in, or it was a house that they lived in, but on the base, they had a ghost that they both saw. And these are people in the military. We're not, that was another aspect of it that made it feel more real. It's like, we're talking about people who are, trained military people. This isn't just some random people. And one of the things they did when they were trying to prove if they had a ghost, they put like baking soda or baby powder on the floor and left the house. And because I think they were having experiences, like every time they left the house, they would come back home and cabinets would be open and stuff like that. And they put powder on the floor, left the house. And when they came back, there was footprints in the powder all walking around the house. So I think I always was like, wow, that's cool and creepy. And in one of the places that I was living in after we did the first season of Haunted, I had an experience where I had a light that was a wire. I had installed a light after the fact, so it was like a wireless switch. So, and it would turn on the lights. It would connect to the socket where the lights were. So it would enable you to turn off the lights from the other side of the room. So there was a wireless aspect to it that could potentially be why the lights might go on by themselves. So I that's the caveat to this story. But there was a few nights for like a week or two where I would wake up at like 5 a.m. I would just wake up and my lights would be on in my room. And that it's such a simple thing, but it's so creepy when you wake up in the middle of the night and your lights are on, because I did not turn the lights on. Is somebody in my room? What is going on? And
that is creepy, man.
Right? It was very creepy. And so I thought of that. I thought of the thing, like maybe I should do the powder thing and put it down. But I ended up chickening out because I thought, I don't want to, if I see footsteps, I got to move. There's no way I'm going to be able to live in this place if I actually see some footprints in the powder. So I think that would be the one thing that I would recommend. That would be a cool thing to try, is the powder trick, and see if you get footprints, if that's a thing, because that was such a creepy visual to me. That
let's write that down, Kyle.
Yeah,
Powder.
put the powder.
powder.
Other than that, I know it's all the the standard night vision and all those things that that people try to do when they're in a haunted house.
That's
Or,
great.
So,
what are some of the stories that really creep you out, and you're like, oh man, I wish I had been a part of that process of creating that story? What are some of those things that inspire you to continue to create and to continue to write?
Well, like I said, we had split up the episodes, and so there was times when I selfishly I was like, well, I want that one, and there was a lot, and sometimes we would be like, all right, you take this one, I'll take that one, because we could only do so much ourselves in the time frame that we had. The big one from the first season was the slaughterhouse one that one of the other producers did. That was the most talked about one, I think, was that the family whose father had buried who was killing people and was burying them in his house, and basically was an unknown serial killer. That was such a cool story. I remember when she was working on it, the producer that did that one, and she was just like, this is really creepy. And I was kind of like, oh man, I wish I could be doing that one. There was another one with a woman in like a nursing home who was possessed, and all the nurses had seen crazy stuff in her room. I didn't do that one. That was one where I was like, oh man, The Exorcist is one of my favorite movies of all time. I think it's like the scariest movie of all time. And so anything that dealt with possession, I was like, I really want to dive into this and see, because I always came at these things from the viewpoint of, like I said, someone who was skeptical. So I was always like, and what I found was that every time I did a story and talked to somebody, they generally made me believe or made me question, well, maybe that seems pretty realistic. So I really wanted to delve into something with possession and talk to people and be like, I don't know how do I explain somebody just lifting off the bed, and this person who I know is credible is telling me, yes, she lifted up off the bed. So those are the kind of ones, like trying to find stories like that really, really inspired me to keep going. The one thing, go ahead.
I was gonna say, are there any of these stories that you're like, I need to write my own horror movie and try to get it out there? Are you allowed to do that, or is there any of those that you're like, I could just create like the best horror movie out there?
Yeah, I've always been somebody who's been into horror movies and writing horror movies, and so there was a few things that I was like, oh, if I ever wrote a horror movie, I would take elements of this story and hype it up. There was variations, but for the most part, I didn't want to, take anyone's story. They were so good. And there was even that the first guy that I had mentioned, Jason, who did Woman in White, had talked about, he wanted to be a writer and do horror movies. And I actually, because I write horror, I told him, I said, I can't read. I don't want to steal your story. So I can't read your thing. I don't want to write something and then I'm inadvertently stealing your story. So I try to kind of stay away from that. The one,
I don't mean to interrupt you again, but the Woman in White story. Did you ever watch the show Supernatural?
I did. They
did a Woman in White episode.
Did they? I don't think I watched Supernatural. I came in maybe like the second or third season is when I finally got on board. And I think I went back and watched everything. And then I only made it for a few seasons. It was one of those shows that I always loved. The creator of Supernatural, Eric Kripke, went to USC Film School when I was there. So he was a year behind me in film school. So I was always a big fan of the show. But I don't think I saw the Woman in White.
It's a Woman in White and she drowned her kids.
Yeah.
And, the premise of it was she would come out and seduce men to kill them.
That's cool. Yeah, I'll have to watch that. Yeah, I mean that's very similar to our story, and that's another thing that a lot of people with our show, like I said, that the guy that did that told us that story, he wanted to make horror movies. He wanted to be a writer and director, which was one of those things where, and a lot of our people were, or not a lot, but there was a few of them that when I would become friendly with them, I would see, follow them on social media and see that they're, horror movie fans, which would sometimes be a little bit of a red flag where you go, is this person making this up? Or are they just telling me a good story because they love horror movies? But when we went and did the show, especially in the case of that guy, Jason, like his daughter, who was hesitant to be on the show, was there, and she taught at a Catholic school. She was a very religious person who, did not take lightly these ideas of demonic things. And, they were in tears talking to each other, and him telling her, like, I haven't been a good dad at times because of what I went through. And so ultimately seeing that, you're like, I just don't think a person, just to tell a cool story or to get themselves in a reality show, would want to put themselves through this emotional torture, or their kids.
Yeah,
so,
for sure.
That always made you feel that these things were realistic. The one thing, this is a little side note, but I always, this is one of the other major takeaways I had from Haunted, was that a lot of the stories that we talked to people about, and even the ones that didn't make it, the recurring theme that I saw was shadow people. That so many people had seen, like, part of their story and part of their haunting was there was something in the shadows, like a figure, like some sort of man or something that was a shadow person they would like be in bed and they'd look in the shadows and it would seem like it was just a shadow, but then they would maybe see hands or a person or something to that effect. And it was a recurring theme in a lot of these that I felt like, that's weird. Like, why are, even it's a ghost story, it's a possession story. There was always what?
UFO abduction story.
Yeah, well, UFO, we didn't do as many UFOs, but I feel like she also sort of she might have had some shadow people in hers. It just seemed to be a recurring theme, and I just was always like, what does that mean? And then there was one expert. I don't remember who it was, but he was an expert that we were going to bring in, and I think I actually talked to him about that, and his theory on why the shadow person was so prevalent was that a lot of this deals with either another dimension or an alternate universe, or that in these spots, or what these people are experiencing, is our reality is sort of dissolving with another reality. And so those shadow people are sort of, you're seeing flickers of that other world coming in. Maybe this is a person in an alternate universe or something, and it's starting to mesh with ours, but it's almost like a projector on the wall. You're just sort of seeing this person coming through, which, again, I don't know if I believe that that's real, but I scientifically, if we learn someday that there are alternate realities, like, I could see that making sense.
It's funny to bring up shadow people. This is a story I've told on the podcast before. It's funny because we have to keep, at my house, when you're sitting on our bed, and everyone in the chat right now knows the story. Is to our left is our master bathroom, and you could see the mirror. Reflecting in the mirror is our master closet. And we have to keep our door shut because we see a shadow person standing in our closet at all. Like, and it'll open the door, it'll close the door, but it'll just sit in the closet, and you can see them staring at you through the reflection in the mirror.
Wow, that's creepy. Yeah. Yeah, and I had, when, like I said, I have watched, I mean, I've been a horror movie fan since I was a little kid. And so I've been watching horror movies my whole life, and I never had nightmares because of them really or anything. But when we were doing the first season of Haunted, I was, and even afterwards, for a few months afterwards, I was having I would wake up in the middle of the night and I was having nightmares, and I would, in my bedroom at the time, I would look, there was a corner when I would wake up that had like a dark shadow. And every time I would wake up, I would sort of kind of jolt awake, and I'd have the show on my mind. And then I would look in that corner and I would stare for a little extra while, as like, to see, is there a person in that corner? Is there something coming out of that corner? And it would always, I would always wake me up more than I wanted to, because I would get a little bit of anxiety because of all the stuff I had seen on the show that was really weighing on me.
Yeah, that whole idea of like dimensionality of shadow people, I feel like that analogy, like, oh, if you hold your hand over a light over a paper, and then you can see the shadow of the hand on the paper, that's like the same idea. And it's like, well, but is it?
Right.
is it that same thing? Because your shadow, or your hand, casts a two-dimensional shadow, and you would say, well, if we can just extrapolate that to 4 dimensions, the 4-dimensional being would cast a 3-dimensional shadow. But we don't know. We don't know that that's the case.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. They all have that kind of shadow people in common. We had a guest on our show, and he was talking about spectrophilial incidents. In other words, ghost sex incidents. And I asked him what was the commonality between those things. And I'm thinking that it was going to be one thing in particular, maybe a sexual thing. And he says, tinnitus.
Interesting.
Ringing in the ears. I was like, what? I have that all the time. So it's like something you don't really expect. But
yeah. And that was the same thing with the show. Like I said, it wasn't every story, but it was enough that like we would get to the point where, especially by the 3rd season, and inevitably I would call someone to do an interview, and a lot of times it would start off, they were like, yeah, and this happened, and then I started to see these like sort of black shadowy figures, and it would be like, yeah, that makes sense. I've heard this before.
So did that make you think that maybe you were having a haunting experience or a paranormal experience in any way?
I did, I did start to feel like, am I bringing back some bad, like, is it bad to work on this show? Am I bringing back
Are you taking your work home with you?
Yeah. I was definitely concerned about it. But it went away. It went away eventually, and I was fine. There's the first season, we had a guy, and I don't remember his name. It wasn't one of the stories that I personally worked on, but he was a psychic. And he had been since he was a kid, and he would read people. Like he would see someone and he would go up to them and tell them something, and apparently was pretty accurate. And when we shot his group on set, I saw him at the beginning of the day pull over one of the producers. And he started saying to her, you had a loss, and I just want you to know that they're okay. I wasn't standing there exactly. I sort of saw it from afar, and then kind of creeped in to hear what was happening. And she started crying, and I think it was that her pet had passed away, and he was telling her that her pet was in a better place, and like he knew all these things somehow. That had happened to her, and she was like really emotionally moved, and it was cathartic for her, and she felt this sense of relief, but like, oh my God, how did he know? And he saw this thing hanging over me. And so the rest of the day, I kept, every time I was walking around, if I was even just going to get a water or something, I was trying to walk by him. I didn't want to go up to him and be like, read me, do me. I felt unprofessional doing that. But I thought, if I've got something negative attached to me, if there's something bad, hopefully he'll say something. If I walk close enough to him, he'll feel it and say something to me. So that whole day I kept walking near him, and I there was a couple of times when he was standing behind me and I sort of brushed up against him, just hoping like if there's any bad mojo, he'll say something. And he didn't tell anything to me. So I used that. I said, okay, I'm gonna consider myself that I'm okay, that I didn't bring anything bad home with me, because I feel like he seemed like the kind of guy that would tell me that he wouldn't let me go on life if he sensed something. So that made me feel better.
Yeah, you got to bump into him. Oh.
Yeah, right. Excuse me. It really was one of those ridiculous moments, because I wanted to go up and say, hey, is there anything attached to me? But it felt I was like, I have to be professional. I'm a producer on this. I didn't want to come off, unprofessionally, but I was dying to know. I was like, I want to know. When I saw this emotional reaction she had, I was like, I want to know if there's anything attached to me. And he never said anything. So I took that as a good sign.
Well,
yeah,
I'll
I
tell
would
you,
take that as well.
Yeah.
we had a guest on last week who read me unprompted, and it freaked me out.
Yeah.
I was like, how does he know this stuff? And I'm still trying to process the whole thing, but
yeah. And again, like I said, and I keep going back to this because I really am somebody who is just so skeptical. And so, when he was telling her this other producer, and she, like I said, she was crying, and this was someone I had worked with. And I know that she, he knew all this stuff about her, and she never had told him anything. And so I was just like, I don't know how he could have, I don't know how that could have been fake.
Or why anyone would be motivated to do
yeah, right, exactly. He had no reason. There was no reason for him to go up to her and say anything. It wasn't like she came to him and asked for a reading. It's not like he was getting paid to do that.
There's no camera on him. There's nothing. Yeah.
This was all behind the scenes. She wasn't the producer on the story. She was on other stories, and he just sort of pulled her aside and said, I feel like and she wasn't like she was depressed at something that had happened months before. So it wasn't like she was moping around set and, someone could go, oh, that person just had a loss in her life. It wasn't anything like that. He just sort of approached her and said, I just want you to know, I know that you had this death, and I just want you to know that they're okay. And he knew all these facts. I forget how specific he was, but I remember her saying it was very specific. And she was just moved by this whole experience.
Yeah, I guess the question I would have for you is how much of the show's budget was dedicated to vetting people, because we've had a handful of psychics on the show, and not all of them are great, but some of them are just, through the roof with their psychic ability. And it's like, oh man, if we could only just figure out beforehand if we had a budget to vet these people, that'd be so great.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I never really saw the budget, but I mean, it was, I think that because they had to go through so many levels, it was first they would go through just the casting, the people that worked in casting. And then if they made it through their BS meter, it would have to go then to the person in charge of casting. And then they would bring it to the executive producers of the show. The executive producers of the show would then bring it to the Netflix executives. And then it would come to us. So there was so many different levels that you had to go through to get approved, that there was plenty of eyes. And a lot of those people in those levels did not necessarily believe. Some of them believed, and there was some people that were very skeptical and just thought, okay, I'm making a show, this is my job. And all the people that we ended up using passed through all those sort of gates. So I think that was pretty much the best way. And then, ultimately, because we were bringing all these other people in, it would have taken a lot of coordinated effort to, if they were part of the story, to tell the same story. Because like I said, I would call. So there was one that we were going to do the first season, and it ended up in the second season. I forget what we called it, but it was basically about these college, with these group of people that when they were in college, they all stayed in the same house, and it was haunted. It was the Mimic. I think it was called the Mimic.
Okay.
And they all lived in this house, and they each had experiences where they would hear someone's voice, that one of the roommates in the house, and they would go in the basement. They would think they were calling them from the basement. They would go there and no one would be there. The person wasn't home. And this thing mimicked different people. And one of the guys who actually moved into the basement saw one of the other roommates and thought she had come talk to him. And then she disappeared and he realized she wasn't even home. And so this story was a whole group of people. And there was I think there was 4 or 5 of them. And I would call them each separately to interview them. And they didn't know what questions I was going to ask. They didn't, there was never really anything when I was interviewing them or researching the story that I was like, well, this person said this and that person said this, so this is probably not true. All their stories fit together. And so it would have been pretty hard, even if they all sat down and said, okay, here's the story. They would have to really get detailed with each other, to have a group of people fooling you. So, and it never felt like they were. So when you have all those people, it's not just one person telling you it, there's other people involved, then it makes it feel like, less opportunity to lie.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like everybody can kind of tell. Right? You're talking to people and you're like, okay, this doesn't pass the smell test,
Yeah. No, I definitely felt as though, and even when I talk to people, when people ask me about the show, if they're believers, I tell them yes, and this happened, and if they're people that are skeptical, I'll always say, maybe yes, if you don't believe in ghosts, maybe they're not ghosts. Maybe it's just something we don't have a scientific explanation for yet. But I know from talking to these people that they believe this happened to them. That was I think one of the things. There was a little bit, I never really looked into it that much, but I think when the show first came out and Netflix, sort of said based on a true story, or these are in all true stories, there was a lot of people that were like, this isn't true. There's no way this could be true. And I think I got a couple messages from random people that had found me out and said, is this show really true? Is this real? and I didn't really engage with anybody, but I would tell people like, it's real as far as these people are concerned. They had an experience. If it was sleep paralysis and it was all somehow in their mind and it can be explained by that, maybe, but they don't think that. To them, this really happened. And I'm confident enough in knowing and speaking to these people. I have a good enough BS meter to know that these people genuinely believe that these things had happened to them.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of the other thing is that we have in common is that we try to present people. We're not trying to pass judgment on people and their stories. We're just trying to present them because that's what is the compelling part, is that story that stays with them. I mean, the story haunts them, or the memory of it haunts them as much as any ghost ever would.
Yeah.
And so you can really, how many transformative experiences does a person have in their life? And so you get the opportunity to share each of these people's transformative experiences in these episodes. So it's really fantastic.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it was like I said, it was a therapy session. It was something certainly by the 3rd season that I learned, because there were some of the, there's all sorts of executives at the production company and executives from the network, and and some of them believed and some of them didn't, and some of them were just making a TV show and would treat it like that. And by the 3rd season, I had gotten very protective of these people because I did have these connections with them doing these interviews, and I was like, this isn't just a contestant. Like, I worked on shows. I worked on Ultimate Beastmaster, which was very much like American Ninja Warrior, that was on Netflix. And you bring in those, we fly in these people, and then it's, you know, you interview them and they run an obstacle course. And a lot of times, I'm sure you know from your experience, it's like, all right, come here, do your thing, and then get out. You know, you're not necessarily, you're not given the same treatment that Tom Cruise is going to get on a set.
Right. Not exactly handled with care. Right.
Right. Exactly. and you know, and there was some people involved with the show that I felt saw these people that way, as they're contestants on a show. And I had gotten, especially even by the second season, I had gotten very protective of these people, because I knew that this was an important thing for them. It was an emotional experience. It was something that they had. And I didn't want them to feel as though they were just a piece of meat that was, you know, that we're just putting you on TV. That I wanted them to know that we cared, and that this was, you know, something that I understand that this is emotional for you.
Yeah. Well, Trace, we appreciate you spending this time with us. It's so fantastic for you to share all these stories, and also the inside behind the scenes. Is there going to be a season 4?
Not that I know of. The last time I checked, there was no talk of a season 4, unfortunately. But in this day and age, you never know when they're going to reboot something. So I mean, it was one of my favorite shows to work on. So I hope it will come back.
What are some other projects that we can look forward to from you?
Well, in a somewhat similar vein, I just did a Halloween variety show special for Hulu. I don't know how much I'm allowed to say about it, so I'll leave it at that. But it's
all right. We'll keep our eyes peeled on your IMDb.
Yes, the comedy Halloween-esque special. There's another twist to it that I don't want to reveal yet, because I'm not sure what I'm allowed to say. But that's going to be a fun show. It's more funny than scary. And then other than that, I've just been writing a bunch of things. I've been staying a little bit in the comedy realm, so and working on different things here or there. But that's about it.
That's fantastic. You know, everybody from the chat, thank you so much for participating and sharing your comments. Trace, thank you so much for the stories. If you have earned your like, please give us a like. If you've earned your subscription, please give us a subscription. But otherwise, we will see you next time, and keep exploring the edges of the unknown.